You ever hear that moment in a story where someone realizes the game is over before the final whistle even blows? That split second when the truth hits harder than any explosion, and everyone in the room knows things won't ever go back to the way they were? That's exactly what happened inside Germany's high command when they finally understood the Red Army wasn't just pushing them back. It was crushing everything in its path. And some of the most decorated German generals, men who had survived every twist of the war so far, suddenly found themselves staring at maps that looked more like death sentences than battle plans. The crazy part? They had warnings for months. Reports, scouts, intercepted communications, all showing the Soviet machine getting bigger, stronger, and more confident. But inside Hitler's circle, nobody wanted to say it out loud. Nobody wanted to admit that the unstoppable German war machine wasn't unstoppable anymore. Not against this enemy. Not against the Red Army that seemed to rise from every destroyed city with more tanks, more men, and more fury than before. So imagine this moment. It's early 1944, a dimly lit command bunker. Cigarette smoke hanging so thick you could almost slice it with a knife. Generals standing over a giant situation map covered in red arrows. And these arrows? They aren't small little pushes. They stretch across entire regions. Arrows the size of rivers. Arrows that scream, "We're coming, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." One general reportedly whispered, almost to himself, "If these numbers are true, then we have lost the East." That wasn't a prediction. It was a realization, and everyone knew it. But here's the part that really hits. These weren't panicky rookies. These were men who had commanded armies, led massive offensives, and helped build blitzkrieg from the ground up. They had seen victories that stunned the world. They had marched across entire nations in weeks. Yet there they were, hands trembling slightly as they moved the markers on the map, seeing their once smooth front lines bending, cracking, folding inward like wet cardboard. And the moment everything snapped was when the updated Soviet numbers arrived. Reinforcements, equipment, supply lines, everything the Red Army had built up for months. One general looked at the papers, frowned, and said in a low voice, This can't be right." Another replied, "I'm afraid it is." And that's when the room went silent. Not angry silent. Not shocked silent. The type of silence when grown men realize there's no winning anymore. Only surviving. Now, you need to understand something important. Germany didn't lose the Eastern Front overnight. It wasn't one battle, one mistake, one moment. It was a grind. A brutal, bloody, exhausting grind that ate up entire armies. And the generals knew it. They had seen the retreat long before Hitler ever admitted it. They had watched as divisions shrank from 20,000 men to 5,000. They had seen tanks break down faster than they could be repaired. They had begged for fuel, for ammo, for manpower that simply didn't exist anymore. But even then, they'd believed they could slow the Soviets down. Maybe hold a line. Maybe make them pay for every kilometer. Until they couldn't. Because the Red Army wasn't the same army from 1941. The Soviets had learned, adapted, evolved. Their commanders weren't just brave. They were smart. Their soldiers weren't just surviving. They were fighting with a purpose. And their equipment, good Lord, the numbers were insane. Germany was building tanks like a boutique workshop. The Soviets were building them like a factory making toys for Christmas. So in that bunker, when the newest reports finally made the picture undeniable, something inside those generals cracked. One of them reportedly muttered, "We are bleeding out faster than we can patch the wounds." Another said, "Every solution we propose requires fuel, men, or time, and we have none." And you could feel it in the air. The fear. Not the fear of death, they were military men. They understood death. But the fear of the inevitable. The fear of being trapped in a collapse they couldn't stop. The fear of knowing their decisions would send thousands of soldiers into battles they already knew couldn't be won. And here's the crazy part. They still had to brief Hitler. Imagine walking into the wolf's lair with maps showing disaster and knowing the man you were about to talk to refused to accept reality. One general later said that briefing Hitler at this stage felt like telling a man his house is burning while he insists the fire is just warm lighting. But inside their own rooms, Away from Hitler's fantasy world, the generals said things that were brutally honest. Things like, "We no longer have the ability to mount a counteroffensive." Or, "If the Soviets push just a little harder, our entire line will shatter." And in some cases, "The Red Army is now stronger than we have ever been." That sentence alone, coming from men who helped conquer half of Europe, tells you everything. One general reportedly stared at the map for over a minute before saying, "This is the end of Army Group Center." Another added, "Then it's the end of the East." And someone else, in the corner of the room, whispered, "If we don't withdraw, we will lose hundreds of thousands." And the response? "We cannot withdraw. The Führer forbids it." And that was the real nightmare. These men weren't free to fix the problem. They could see the disaster. They could calculate the outcome. They could predict exactly where the front would break. But they weren't allowed to act. They were like firefighters told to let the house burn because the owner insisted everything was fine. The frustration in those rooms must have been unbearable. They weren't just losing territory. They were losing armies. Divisions that had existed since the early days of the war were being erased in weeks. Entire corps were being swallowed by the Soviet advance. And the generals knew they were next. But the moment that truly crushed them was when they realized the Soviets had mastered something Germany desperately needed: momentum. Once the Red Army hit full speed, it didn't stop. Pushed through everything. It rolled over defenses like a tidal wave. And the generals, staring at those red arrows, knew they had no counter. And that's when they started saying the things you almost never hear generals admit during wartime. Things like, "We can't hold them," or "Our positions are untenable," or "We are witnessing the destruction of the Eastern Front." Imagine being a soldier who spent years believing your army was the strongest in the world, only to have the very men who built that army finally admit the truth. The Red Army wasn't just winning. They were unstoppable. And deep down, every general in that room knew exactly what that meant. If they couldn't stop the Soviets in the East, then the war was already over. Maybe not today. Maybe not next week. But the path was already set, and nothing, no miracle weapon, no heroic counterattack, no speech from Hitler, could change it anymore. The most haunting thing said that day came from a general who had been quiet the whole meeting. When he finally spoke, he said, "We are no longer planning for victory. We are planning for survival." That wasn't strategy. That was surrender without saying the word. And that's where everything truly begins. You ever notice how sometimes the truth doesn't hit all at once? Comes in pieces. Little cracks at first. Something feels off, but you tell yourself it's nothing. Then the cracks get bigger. Then they spread. And eventually the whole thing shatters. That's exactly what happened to the German High Command as the Red Army kept rolling west. Every week brought a new report, a new breakthrough, a new gap in the line, and each one cut deeper than the last. What started at the edges was now hitting the core. Imagine sitting in a room full of experienced commanders who spent their entire careers believing Germany could outthink, outmaneuver, or outfight anyone. And now, they were watching the Red Army grind through their best units like a machine built for one purpose: destroy everything in front of it. The tension inside those bunkers was unreal. Officers walked faster. Voices got quieter. People hesitated before speaking. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because they knew how dangerous the truth had become. One general said it perfectly: "The facts are now treason." Think about that. Saying "we're losing" was treated like sabotage. So these generals were stuck whispering the truth to each other, avoiding saying it too loudly in case someone in the room decided to report them. And yes, that actually happened. Paranoia wasn't just real, it was everywhere. But the biggest crack in their confidence came after one moment that none of them could deny: the fall of key cities on the Eastern Front. Each one that fell wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a psychological earthquake. Cities that had resisted invasions for months were now collapsing in days. One after another, like dominoes. And behind every Soviet breakthrough came another wave of reinforcements, as if the Red Army had endless reserves hidden just over the horizon. One general said, "Every time we stop one attack, two more appear." Another snapped, "We can no longer measure the Red Army by divisions. We must measure them by fronts. That's how overwhelming it felt. The people who designed Blitzkrieg were now describing the Soviet army like it was a force of nature, something you endured, not something you stopped. And what really terrified them wasn't just the speed or the numbers. It was the coordination. Soviet offensives weren't random charges. They were calculated, planned, multi-layered. If Germany held one position, the Soviets hit another. If Germany sent reinforcements, the Soviets struck somewhere else. It was chess, not chaos. And the German generals hated that because the Eastern Front had stopped being their game. You can almost picture it. A room full of men staring at a map that no longer behaved the way they expected it to. The front lines weren't reacting like they used to. The Soviets weren't breaking where they were supposed to. German counterattacks weren't doing anything except wasting fuel and men. And every time the generals updated the board, the picture got worse. And then came the supply problem, the number one killer of armies. Fuel shortages, ammo shortages, manpower shortages, pick any category you want, and Germany was failing in it. One general wrote in his diary, "Our troops fight, but our supplies do not." That one sentence explains everything. Because meanwhile, the Red Army was solving those exact problems. Their trains were running. Their factories were pumping out tanks like they were made of paper. Their supply lines were growing, not shrinking. And their troops were being rotated and reinforced instead of being stretched thinner and thinner until nothing was left. One officer tried to sound hopeful and said, "If we can just stabilize the front, we can regroup." And another officer shot back, "Stabilize where? With who? With what fuel?" That wasn't sarcasm. That was desperation. And then came one of the most brutal realizations. The thing the generals hated admitting the most. The Red Army was outlearning them. German tactics that once seemed unstoppable were now predictable. Soviet commanders knew how to counter them. They adapted faster. Their communication improved. Their coordination tightened. And the German generals saw it in real time, with every report laid on the table. One general slammed his fist on the table and said, "We trained them too well." He meant it. All those early victories taught the Soviets exactly how Germany fought. And once the Soviets learned those lessons, they used them mercilessly. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment came during a meeting when a German general looked at the casualty reports. Rows and rows of numbers. Whole battalions erased. Veteran divisions reduced to shadows of themselves. And none of the losses could be replaced. He whispered, "We are losing the war by arithmetic." Then came the final crack, the realization that even if they pulled off a miracle victory, one great battle, one brilliant counteroffensive, it wouldn't actually change the outcome. Because the Soviets had more tanks, more soldiers, more artillery, more resources, more everything. Germany wasn't fighting an army anymore. It was fighting an entire empire. The generals knew it. They just couldn't say it out loud. So they started saying softer things. Things like, "We must reconsider our expectations," or "The situation is fluid," or "We need more time." But everyone in the room understood what those words really meant. They were stalling. They were delaying the inevitable moment when someone would have to tell Hitler the truth he did not want to hear. But the turning point, the real turning point, came when a general looked at the newest Soviet offensives and said in a flat, empty voice, "They are no longer attacking to push us back. They are attacking to end us." And another responded, "And they will." You can almost feel the dread filling that room like water rising in a sinking ship. Everyone was trying to act calm. Everyone was trying to pretend they had a plan. But deep down, they knew the truth. The Red Army wasn't just advancing. It wasn't just breaking lines. It wasn't just winning. It was collapsing the entire Eastern Front from within. And every German general in that bunker could see the shape of the disaster forming, even if Hitler refused to look at it. It's like watching an avalanche from inside a cabin. The sound starts small. Then it builds. Then the whole mountain comes down. And by the time you hear it, it's already too late. That's what the generals felt. That's what they saw. And the worst part? They still had to pretend everything was under control. The final winter of the war pressed down on Europe like a weight that no army could ignore. Supply lines were stretched, men were exhausted, and the machinery of total war had begun to devour itself. Yet in those final months, the decisions made, the battles fought, and the resolve shown by soldiers on every front would shape the world that came after. Reports from the Eastern Front describe entire regiments advancing through waist-deep snow, pushing toward positions that had changed hands so many times they were little more than frozen ruins. Veterans recalled that visibility was so low that enemy lines weren't seen as much as sensed. Shadows moving through blowing snow, muzzle flashes cutting through the whiteout. Artillery observers struggled to identify targets, relying on sound more than sight, and even then, the cold distorted everything. It was a battlefield where instinct mattered as much as training, and survival hinged on seconds. In the West, the air war intensified into a relentless rhythm. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, often returning with fuel tanks nearly empty and control surfaces shredded by flak. Interviews later described how the sky itself felt crowded, streaks of tracer fire, burning aircraft falling through cloud layers, and the constant roar of engines. Ground crews worked through the night under blackout conditions, hands numb as they rearmed and repaired fighters that had barely cooled from combat. Amid all of this, commanders faced impossible choices. Intelligence reports arrived late or incomplete. Weather shifted hourly. Reinforcements were weeks away if they came at all. Yet movements had to be made, orders had to be given, and every decision carried consequences measured in lives. Diaries from officers on both sides reveal the same tension. The knowledge that one mistake could collapse an entire sector, and that there was none, for hesitation. As spring approached, the tempo of the war changed again. Roads once frozen solid turned to rivers of mud, slowing armored divisions to a crawl. River crossings became deadly bottlenecks. Entire battalions fought to secure a single bridge or hold a single village that command considered insignificant on a map, but strategically vital to whoever stood on it. And then, slowly, the front lines began to fracture. Soldiers who had spent years fighting watched the enemy retreat for the final time. Some described the moment with relief, others with disbelief, and many with an exhaustion so deep it couldn't be put into words. Towns were liberated. Civilians emerged from cellars. Flags that had been hidden for years rose again above shattered rooftops. But even in those final weeks, the cost remained high. Isolated pockets of resistance fought with the desperation of forces that knew they had nothing left to lose. Skirmishes broke out in forests, city streets, and mountain passes. Every gain came with a price. When the final ceasefires were declared, soldiers stood among the ruins of a world they barely recognized. Some went home. Some had no home to return to. Many carried memories they would never speak of again. History records the battles, dates, and outcomes. But the final truth of the war lived in the men who endured it. Those who marched, flew, fought, froze, dug in, rose again, and saw the conflict through to its final breath. Their stories are the bridge between the world that was and the world that emerged from the ashes. This last part closes their chapter. But the echoes of what they lived through remain, shaping how the future remembers the past.